Hey everyone, welcome back to the Dental Wolf. So today we're going to be continuing our terminology video series, and today we're talking about break-even and economies of scale. So first off, what is break-even? Well, break-even is the amount that you need to produce or collect in order to cover all the expenses in your office. So basically, it's when your collection minus your direct and fixed expenses equals zero. It's when you've covered all of your expenses in the office without paying yourself. So this sounds pretty straightforward, but in reality it's a little complicated to think about because typically your fixed expenses will stay the same, but your direct expenses will grow as your production increases. So a good way to calculate this out is your break-even production or collection is going to be equal to your fixed expenses divided by 1 minus your direct expense percent of collections. Now this equation may not make sense to you. If you're mathematically minded, kind of like I am, you can run through this proof right here. I won't go through it in this video, but I'll leave it up there so you can pause it and check it out. But this is how I got to that calculation. So break-even is a pretty simple concept. It's basically just how much do I need to produce in order to pay all of my expenses. A similar concept to break-even is this concept of economies of scale. So I mentioned economies of scale in the income statement video, and I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into what economies of scale are. So economies of scale is basically as you produce more, your expenses as a percent total will decrease. And in dental practices, this is because your direct expenses are fairly minimal and your fixed expenses don't change dramatically as production increases. Let's do a quick example so you can understand what economies of scale look like. So let's say we have a practice that's producing $500,000 and their direct expenses are roughly 10% of production. And their fixed expenses for this practice, so their rent, their salaried employees, all of that other stuff is about $250,000. And let's say we have another practice that's producing $1 million, and so their direct expenses are going to be 10% of what they produce, so $100,000, and their fixed expenses are going to be $250,000 because they're roughly not going to change. Now this is a really simplified version. Obviously, if you're going from $500,000 to $1 million, your fixed expenses are going to increase. You're probably going to hire someone, things like that. But just for this example, we're going to keep it the same. So in practice 1, the total practice expenses as a percentage of production is going to be roughly 60%. But in practice 2, because they're producing more, the total practice expenses as a percentage of production is only 35%. That means the dentist is actually taking home much more as a percentage of his production because he's producing more and his expenses aren't growing at the same rate. Now, something to note, I want to make it clear that bigger isn't always better. If you can't control your fixed costs, it's going to be really difficult to meet your break-even point. We have a professor at our school that illustrates this pretty well. He says he calculates his break-even point, figures out what that production is, and then finds out about what time in the year he hits his production. So let's say his break-even production is $600,000. And he hits that in August or September. Well, he thinks about that in the terms of, I have to work until August or September before I even get a paycheck. So if you think about that, that's kind of a sombering thought to work the majority of the year before you even get a paycheck, pre-tax, that is. It's a good way to think about how break even and these economies of scale actually impact you. Now, with that being said, a lot of dentists will actually advocate for a small production or small cost business model. And I want to show you what that looks like and why they advocate for that. So let's say a typical practice overhead is around 60 to 70%, 70% being kind of on the higher side. The low cost model, however, is always going to want to maintain their overhead below 50%. So again, let's do 2 practices. Let's say we have our first practice that produces $1 million every year. And because they're a high overhead, high production model, their total expense percentage is 70%. So their operating income, or in other words, their take-home pay before taxes, is $300,000. Now, on the other hand, there's another practice that produces $600,000 and their total expense percentage is only 50%. Because they're a low cost, low overhead model. And therefore their operating income is going to be, or their operating or their take home income is going to be $300,000 pre-tax. So on one hand you have high production, high overhead, and on the other hand you have low production, low overhead. but they both have the same pre-tax take home. So this is why the low production, low overhead model works for a lot of people, because they say I only have to produce a little over half of what my competitors do, and I still have the same pre-tax take home. There's a few problems with a low production, low overhead model, however. First of all, it's not scalable. You're not going to be able to add associates to a low overhead, low production model very easily. And two, you can't pay the staff as much. You're going to have to find ways to cut staff costs as much as you can. And number three, the practice is totally dependent on you. Like I said, it's going to be really difficult to add associates, additional hygiene, things like that. A lot of the income is going to be based on what you produce. So I'm not really going to advocate for one model or the other. I just wanted to present to you the idea that there are more business models out there than just kind of your standard high production, high cost dental practice. And there are advantages and disadvantages to both. I think I've seen pretty compelling arguments on both sides. So I'd encourage you to really research and understand why you do one or the other and figure out which one's right for you. I don't think all dentists should do one or the other. I think there's a model for every dentist out there. Well, I hope that helped. I hope that helped you understand break even and economies of scale a little bit more. I know I talked about economies of scale in the income statement video, and I wanted to dive into that a little bit more to explain what economies of scale actually meant. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to comment down below or email us at dentalwolfonline@gmail.com, and we will catch you on the flip side.